The Nose. By Ryunosuke Akutagawa. Zenchi Naigu's nose was famous throughout the village of Iknoo. It was 5 or 6 inches long, hanging from his upper lip all the way down to his chin. It was the same thickness from root to tip, like a long, thin sausage dangling from the middle of his face. Naigu, now over 50, had been tormented by this nose ever since he was a young acolyte. Even now, having risen to the position of Naidojo Gubu, he was secretly troubled by it. Of course, he always pretended not to care. This wasn't simply because he was a monk who should be devoting himself to the contemplation of the Pure Land. Rather, he was more afraid of people knowing that he was bothered by his nose. In his everyday conversations, he dreaded the very mention of the word nose. There were 2 reasons why Naigu was so embarrassed by his nose. First, it was simply inconvenient. He couldn't even eat his meals alone. If he tried, the tip of his nose would dip into his bowl. So, he had one of his disciples sit opposite him at mealtimes and hold his nose up with a small wooden board about an inch wide and 2 feet long. But this arrangement was no easy task for either the disciple or Naigu. There was even a famous incident, which became the talk of Kyoto, when a young attendant who was holding up Naigu's nose sneezed, his hand trembled, and the nose plunged into the porridge. However, this inconvenience was not the main reason for Naigu's suffering. What truly tormented him was the blow to his pride. The people of Iknoo considered Naigu's extraordinary nose a blessing, assuming that no woman would marry a man with such a nose. Some even speculated that he had become a monk because of it. But Naigu didn't feel that his monkhood lessened his troubles in any way. His pride was far too delicate to be soothed by such practical considerations as marriage. He tried, both actively and passively, to restore his wounded self-esteem. First, he tried to find ways to make his nose appear shorter. When he was alone, he would spend hours in front of the mirror, tilting his head at various angles, propping his chin on his hand, or touching his chin with his finger, desperately trying to find a flattering angle. But he never once succeeded in making his nose look as short as he wished. Sometimes, the more he tried, the longer it seemed to appear. At such times, he would put the mirror away with a sigh and reluctantly return to his sutra desk to read the Canon Sutra. He also became obsessed with other people's noses. The temple at Iknoo was a place where monks often gathered for lectures and sermons. The temple grounds were filled with monks' quarters, and the bathhouse was always busy with monks coming and going. Naigu would scrutinize the faces of these people, hoping to find someone with a nose like his own. He yearned for the reassurance that he wasn't alone. His eyes saw neither the dark blue suikan nor the white katabira garments. He barely noticed the orange caps or the grey robes, so accustomed was he to their sight. He saw only noses. But while there were plenty of hooked noses, he couldn't find a single one like his. The more he failed to find one, the more depressed he became. Sometimes, in the middle of a conversation, he would unconsciously pinch the tip of his dangling nose and blush like a child, overcome by a sense of shame. He even went so far as to search the Buddhist scriptures, hoping to find a character with a similar nose, someone who could offer him some comfort. But nowhere did it say that Moggallana or Sariputra had long noses. Of course, Nagarjuna and Asvaghosha were also depicted as bodhisattvas with ordinary noses. When Naigu heard a story about Liu Bei of Shuhan having long ears, he wished that it had been his nose instead, imagining how much less lonely he would feel. It goes without saying that while Naigu was making these passive efforts, he was also actively seeking ways to shorten his nose. He tried almost everything imaginable. He drank a decoction of snake gourd. He even applied rat urine to his nose. But no matter what he did, his nose remained stubbornly the same, dangling 5 or 6 inches from his upper lip. Then one autumn, a disciple who had traveled to Kyoto on an errand for Naigu learned of a method for shortening long noses from a doctor he knew. The doctor was a man who had come from China and was now serving as a priest at Chorakuji Temple. As usual, Naigu pretended not to care about his nose and didn't immediately express any interest in trying the method. Instead, he casually mentioned at every meal how sorry he felt for troubling his disciple with holding up his nose. Of course, he was secretly hoping that his disciple would persuade him to try the treatment. The disciple was not unaware of Naigu's ploy, but he seemed more moved by his master's desperation than annoyed by his manipulative tactics. As Naigu had hoped, the disciple enthusiastically urged him to try the method. And just as Naigu had planned, he eventually agreed to his disciple's fervent pleas. The method was remarkably simple: boil the nose in hot water and then have someone step on it. Hot water was readily available at the temple bathhouse. The disciple immediately brought back a bucket of steaming water, so hot that it was impossible to put a finger in it. But if Naigu were to put his nose directly into the bucket, the steam might burn his face. So they made a hole in a small wooden tray, used it as a lid for the bucket, and had Naigu insert his nose through the hole into the hot water. Strangely, even though his nose was immersed in the scalding water, he didn't feel any pain. After a while, the disciple said, "I think it's boiled enough." Naigu smiled wryly, thinking that no one would guess they were talking about a nose. His nose, steamed in the boiling water, felt itchy, as if bitten by fleas. When Naigu pulled his nose out of the hole in the tray, the disciple, putting all his weight on both feet, began to trample on the still steaming nose. Naigu lay on his side, stretching his nose out on the floorboards, watching his disciple's feet move up and down. The disciple, with an occasional look of pity towards Naigu's bald head, would ask, "Does it hurt?" The doctor said to step on it hard. "But does it hurt?" Naigu tried to shake his head to indicate that it didn't hurt, but with his nose being trampled, he couldn't move his head freely. So, rolling his eyes upward and noticing the chapped skin on his disciple's feet, he replied in an irritated voice, "It doesn't hurt." In fact, having his itchy nose trampled felt rather pleasant. After a while, small, millet grain-like bumps appeared on his nose. It looked like a plucked bird that had been roasted whole. Seeing this, the disciple stopped and muttered to himself. He said to pull these out with tweezers. Naigu puffed out his cheeks in displeasure but silently let the disciple do as he pleased. He appreciated the disciple's kindness, of course, but he couldn't help feeling offended at having his nose treated like a mere object. With the resigned expression of a patient undergoing surgery by a doctor he didn't trust, he watched as the disciple extracted the oily bumps from the pores of his nose with tweezers. The greasy matter came out in the shape of bird feather quills, about 1/4 of an inch long. When this was all done, the disciple, with a sigh of relief, said, "Now we need to boil it again." Naigu, still frowning with dissatisfaction, again submitted to the disciple's instructions. When they took his nose out of the hot water the second time, it was noticeably shorter. It now looked no different from an ordinary hooked nose. Naigu, stroking his shortened nose, hesitantly peeked into the mirror offered by the disciple, feeling awkward and embarrassed. His nose, the nose that had once hung down to his chin, had shrunk almost unbelievably, now barely clinging to his upper lip with a pathetic gasp. The patchy redness was probably from being trampled. No one would laugh at him now. Naigu's face in the mirror, looking at Naigu's face outside the mirror, blinked with satisfaction. However, for the rest of the day, he was anxious that his nose might grow back. Whether he was chanting sutras or eating, he would constantly touch the tip of his nose, checking its length. But the nose remained obediently perched above his lip, showing no signs of dangling down again. When he woke up early the next morning, the first thing he did was feel his nose. It was still short. He felt a sense of liberation he hadn't experienced since completing the long task of copying the Lotus Sutra. But after a few days, Naigu made a disconcerting discovery. A samurai who visited the temple on business seemed even more amused by him than before, staring at his nose and barely speaking. Moreover, the young attendant who had once dropped his nose into the porridge, upon encountering Naigu in the corridor, initially tried to suppress his laughter by looking down, but finally burst out laughing uncontrollably. Even the junior monks who served Naigu, though they listened respectfully to his instructions while in his presence, would snicker as soon as he turned his back. This happened not just once or twice, but repeatedly. At first, Naigu attributed this to the change in his appearance. But this explanation didn't seem entirely satisfactory. Certainly, the change in his face must have been the reason why the young attendant and the other monks were laughing. Yet there was something different about their laughter now compared to when his nose was long. It was true that his unfamiliar short nose might appear more comical than his familiar long nose, but there seemed to be something more to it. "They never laughed at me so openly before," Naigu would sometimes mutter to himself, pausing in his sutra recitation and tilting his bald head. At such times, the dear Naigu would gaze vacantly at the image of Fugen hanging beside him and, recalling the days just 4 or 5 days ago when his nose was still long, would fall into a melancholy mood, like a man who has fallen from grace, reminiscing about his glorious past. Unfortunately, Naigu lacked the insight to answer this question. The truth was that there are two conflicting emotions in the human heart. Of course, everyone sympathizes with the misfortunes of others. But when that person manages to overcome their misfortune, we feel a sense of dissatisfaction, as if something is missing. To put it bluntly, we almost wish that the person would fall back into the same misfortune. Unconsciously, we harbor a kind of passive hostility towards that person. What Naigu sensed, though he couldn't explain it, was this self-serving attitude in the behavior of the monks and villagers of Aiknoo, which made him feel vaguely uncomfortable. As a result, Naigu became increasingly irritable. He would snap at anyone for the slightest reason. Eventually, even the disciple who had treated his nose began to whisper behind his back, "Naigu will be punished for the sin of greed." But what angered Naigu most was the behavior of the mischievous young attendant. One day, hearing a dog barking loudly, Naigu went outside and saw the attendant chasing a long-haired, skinny dog with a 2-foot-long piece of wood, shouting, "Don't get your nose hit. Watch out for your nose." Naigu snatched the piece of wood from the attendant's hand and struck him hard across the face. It was the same piece of wood that had been used to hold up his nose. Naigu now regretted having his nose shortened. Then one night, a strong wind suddenly arose after sunset, and the sound of the wind bell in the pagoda echoed loudly through his pillow. The cold had also intensified, making it difficult for the elderly Naigu to fall asleep. As he lay awake in bed, he noticed that his nose felt unusually itchy. He touched it and found it slightly swollen and damp, even a little warm. "Perhaps the forced shortening has caused some illness," Naigu murmured, holding his nose with the reverence he would use to offer flowers to Buddha. The next morning, when Naigu woke up as usual, he found the temple garden covered in golden leaves that had fallen overnight from the ginkgo and horse-chestnut trees. Frost had formed on the roof of the pagoda, and the 9 rings on top gleamed dazzlingly in the pale morning sun. Zenchi Naigu stood on the veranda, breathing deeply. It was then that a sensation he had almost forgotten returned to him. He quickly touched his nose. What he felt was not the short nose from the night before. It was the old, long nose, hanging down 5 or 6 inches from his upper lip to his chin. His nose had grown back to its original length overnight. And at the same time, he felt a sense of relief, similar to what he had felt when his nose was shortened, welling up within him. "No one will laugh at me now," Naigu whispered to himself, his long nose swaying in the cool autumn breeze.